Welcome back to Web Design Bootcamp Day 5. Today we're going to be going over the difference between inline and block elements, and we're going to be talking about the box model and different ways to position items on a page. First I want to say that we need to talk about how the page is structured. So a document has a sort of normal flow. Everything's going to be structured it's going to show in the browser top to bottom, left to right. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. That's not important right now. First, we're going to talk about block level elements. So some of the elements at a block level include headers, paragraphs, lists, dividers, and there's a bunch more. A lot of the elements that we've used so far are actually block level. So if we want to make something block level, we can actually change that in CSS. There's a property called display that we can actually change. We can just change that to block, and that will be a block level element then. So just a few rules about block level elements. They always start on a new line, and there's always a new line placed after it. And the reason for that is because they take up the full width of the browser. So it goes all the way from the left all the way to the right. And because it goes all the way from the left to the right, there's not really any room for anything else. So it just, whatever element comes after it is placed on a new line. And another thing about block level elements, we can change the width and height of them. So here's just a visual example. Like we can just pretend that this is our HTML. If we have a container element, and that will just be like maybe the browser window. So we have a bunch of different block level elements. We can pretend this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is a list. It's all going to appear right underneath each other. It's not going to appear on the side because this takes up all of the width of the page. So that's block level elements. And here's an example, actually using that header, paragraph, and unordered list. And if we look at this in the browser, we'll see that they are all on different lines. And that's block level elements. So let's talk about inline level elements. Inline level elements, they include anchors, spans, emphasized text, strong text, basically anything that involves text. It's going to be in line with text most of the time. That's when we're going to use inline level elements. So they don't start on a new line, and they only take up as much space or as much width as they need. And because they only take up as much width as they need, we can't actually set a width and height on inline elements. We can't do that. So in order to make an element inline, say it's a block element and we want to make it inline, we can actually change the CSS property display and we can make that an inline element. So here's just a visual example. Inline level elements, you can see that we actually have elements placed beside each other. And then we have some below it, but that's only because we don't have enough room on the side. So now we have inline level elements below it, and we have one beside it and below it again because we ran out of room. That's inline level elements. If we look at an example, here's a paragraph. And that paragraph is a block level element, but inside of it are inline elements. We have some text, and then we have a link. We have emphasized text and strong text. Look at it in the browser. It's all in line with the text, and that's inline elements. Good question here. What's an inline block, though? So inline blocks don't start on a new line, and they'll take up only as much width as they need. So in that way, it's almost the exact same as inline. So what exactly is the difference? The difference is that we can set the width and height of an inline block. So a way to think of this is that the inside is a block, but the outside is inline. And we'll see this in an example. And here's a visual example right here. We have an inline block, and we can set the width and height, but elements are displayed beside of it. So here's an example here. Both of these belong in the class example, and you can see that I've typed up example. And we went ahead and changed the display property to inline block. And whenever we view this in the browser, we'll see that we did set the width and height. They're both set at 100, but this next element that comes after it is actually placed right beside it because it's in line on the outside. It's an inline block. But you'll notice that there's a little space in here, and that's really annoying. What if we wanted these exactly side by side? We don't want a space there. And where does that space come from? That's because we pressed enter on the keyboard, or we pressed tabs before we typed our next element. Even though it's not a space, it's going to render in the browser as a space. So how do we remove it? We simply remove the space. So you'll see right here, they actually type these elements side by side. There's no space in between these two. So whenever we actually pull this up in a browser, they are now side by side. And there's a lot of display properties like flex and grid, and those are really fun to work with, but we're not going to work with them today because they are a little bit more complicated, and you could actually talk like an entire day about those. We're not going to do that though. Actually, we're going to move ahead and just talk about the box model, and this is sort of the model that all visual elements on the page are going to follow. So we can have paddings, borders, and margins in HTML. And these will be shown differently depending on whether the element's inline or block element. But first we're going to talk about block elements. So here's the box model right here. We can see we have the content, we have padding, we have border, we have margins. And you can see right here that if we were to change the padding here, we would be changing the padding that's right outside of the content. And then we have the border here. We can actually change the border with CSS as well, and that's just outside of the padding. We can change the width of it, and that can be any size that we want it, in pixels, in centimeters, in inches, whatever unit we want to use. And we can change the style. So for instance, we can make it a dashed line, or we can make it a solid line. We can also change the color of it. So we can use our hexadecimal notation, or we can use any of the color names already built into CSS. Sea green, for an example. And then we can also change the margins, and we can change that with CSS, and that's just right outside of the border. So let's go ahead and just demonstrate that with an actual example. So right here we have a paragraph inside of a divider, and that divider is in the class example, and you'll see that we style it here. This is going to give us a demonstration of how the box model works in the browser. So we can actually see this in action by right-clicking on the element in the browser and just clicking inspect. We can also just but we can tap F12 on our keyboard, and that will also pull up developer tools. And you'll see here that we have our developer tools pulled up. And if we just roll over the element, our divider tag, we can actually see the box model in play. We'll have in blue is our actual content, and we change the width and height of those. And you'll also see that we have padding in green, margins in orange, and we can actually see the border here. These colors are going to be different if you're using Firefox or maybe Microsoft Edge, but it's the same thing. We have a padding followed by border followed by margin. And that's our box model. This becomes really helpful, especially when we're working on really large websites, because when we're making really large websites, we may not know where the problem is in CSS, and we can just simply browse through our HTML, and then we can look at the CSS properties for that HTML, and we can find out, oh, that's the problem, and we can go ahead and fix it in our code, or not code, but in our markup. So we can actually change specific sides if we just don't want to change the entire thing. If we just want to change a specific side, we can change the top, the right, the bottom, the left. We can change all of those by just typing in a dash and then whatever side. And we can do that with the borders, and we can do that with the margins. And that's a lot to type. No one really wants to type that much, so we have shorthand properties. Instead, we can just, instead of typing padding top, padding bottom, padding blah, 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 we can just type padding, and then we can just list the values. And the order of those are top, right, bottom, left. How exactly do we remember those? We just remember trouble, because they all start with, it's T-R-B-L. And that's just trouble without all the vowels taken out. And that's just an easy way to remember that. And we can do that with the padding and margin. We can't do that with the border because we have to specify the size, the style, and the color, and the shorthand property of the border. And we can't really use the top, right, bottom, left, because we'd have to type size, style, color, size, style, color, size, style, color, and we can't do that. But we can still use border top and border bottom, and we can change the size, style, and color of those. Anyway, that's the box model of block elements. If we have an inline element, things are going to be a little different in the box model. For example, the width will actually have no effect on the element, and the height won't change either. And also the padding will not affect the content around it. The padding's still going to be there, but it's not going to shift the element. The padding's just going to be sort of applied around it. It's not going to move the element itself. And we also only have left and right margins applied. The top and bottom margins aren't going to be applied at all on inline elements. So let's go ahead and look at this just by looking at our old example, and we'll just modify it a little bit. You'll see here in our class selector that I just made this an inline element. By default, it was a block element, and I made an inline element now. And I also made a paragraph inline because we can't have block level elements inside of an inline element, because if we open that up in a browser, it's going to render and it's going to look really weird. So let's not do that. Let's just go ahead and make that inline. So if we were to look at this in a browser and maybe pull up the developer tools just so we can see the box model, you'll see it didn't take up the width and height that we specified. It's supposed to be 400 by 200, but it's not because it's an inline element. And you'll see that we still have the padding, but it didn't shift the element at all. And we still have the border, And we still have margins, but we only have the left and right. The top and bottom margins aren't there anymore. So that's basically inline elements. Let's go ahead and talk about positioning those elements. So all of these elements, whether it's block or inline elements, they all follow the normal flow of the page, but we can actually change that. We can determine whether an element falls within the normal flow or whether it's taken out of the normal flow of the document. And the best way to show this is actually with an example rather than just talk about it. So go ahead, if you want, you can go ahead and just like pause the video if you want to go ahead and type this up, see it yourself. I'm going to go ahead and go on. But let's talk about static positioning first. So with static positioning, and we'll use the example that we typed up earlier to show this. With static positioning, elements are where they are originally in HTML. So that's just where they are by default. And the default position for any element is actually static. It's always going to be static. Another thing to note is that margins are going to collapse with other elements when they're positioned statically. And we'll see this in the example as well. So this is what it looks like in the browser. We have 5 boxes and we have our text position. Let's talk about it. And you'll see that these are all blocks. So they're just going to display on a line all by themselves. But this is their default position in the browser. We've not shifted these left, right, up, down. We haven't shifted them at all. This is just where they render, where they're going to render in the browser. Now let's go ahead and talk about shifting elements. Let's talk about relative positioning. So we can move elements relative to their original position on the page. And we can do that using the top, right, bottom, and left CSS properties. And another thing to note about this is that vertical margins collapse just like static elements. And actually, I didn't talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the browser preview. You'll see that, let's pretend we have a margin. We can see the margin here. We can't see it here, but if we were to pull up developer tools, we'd see that we have a margin here. There's a margin on this element, and it's about here, from here to here, if you can see my mouse. It's from the bottom of this element to the top of this second element. And that's one whole margin. But this margin actually has the same width, not the same width, but the same height margin, but they collapse. They actually, where this margin's, a good way to think of this, we have a margin here, and then we have a margin here, but they're both taking up the same space. That's a good way to think about it. And that's because these margins collapsed into each other. And that's what happens whenever we have something positioned either relatively or statically. That's going to happen in both of those types of positioning. And another thing to note is this also stays in the document flow, just like static elements. And they don't move surrounding elements. It's not taken out of the flow, but it doesn't move surrounding elements, which all sounds confusing. Let's actually pull up an example and see what this looks like. So let's change our HTML, or actually let's change our CSS. We can make the position relative, and we can add a left and top property, and we can just set both of those to 100 pixels. And this way we'll see an example of relative position in our browser. So right here we have it pulled up, and it looks very similar, except the first element, this is the element with the example ID, the relatively positioned element. We'll see that it's moved from the top 100 pixels and from the left 100 pixels. And it's moved relative to where it was originally on the page. You'll see there's a big space where it used to be. That's because this is still in the document flow, and this is where it originally would have been. And these elements follow where it used to be, but we moved it down, we moved it to the right. That doesn't mean that these elements are going to shift, because in a way it's still here in the document flow, even though it shows up here, because we use the top and left properties. But that's relative positioning. Now, what if we didn't want to have this space here where we move the element? That's where we talk about absolute positioning. And an absolutely positioned element is taken out of the flow entirely. So it's almost like it's not even there. These elements are actually going to move up whenever we have an absolutely positioned element. And another thing to note is that the vertical margins don't collapse when it's positioned absolutely. And that's just more of a technical note. We'll actually see this whenever we write our own HTML and CSS. Whenever we write our own CSS and position things, we'll see, oh, the margin for the second element, it's like it's almost not even there, and that's because it collapsed with another margin. And that only happens with vertical margins. With horizontal margins, left and right margins, it doesn't do that. It only happens with vertical margins. But we don't really need to care about that right now. The one thing that's important to know is it's taken out of the document flow, and because of that, it won't influence any elements that come after it in HTML. So let's go ahead and change our CSS. We'll just change position to absolute. And whenever we look at this in the browser, we'll see all of the other 4 elements, they shifted up because this is taken out of the document flow entirely. We still moved it down 100 pixels and to the right 100 pixels. That's still the same. And the vertical margins didn't collapse. That's just more of a technical note, though, again. And it's just taken completely out of the document flow. And that's basically absolute positioning. And that's basically all that I have for today. But I did want to leave on a fun fact. And that fact is that the Google homepage doesn't actually use proper HTML to center its page. It's weird, but it uses the center tag. And that's been marked by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. They say that that is entirely obsolete, the center tag is. And it's been that way since HTML4. There's a bunch of reasons they could be doing that. They could be using the center tag to save bandwidth or something, but other elements are actually centered using proper CSS. So I really have no idea why they would do that. Bottom line is, do not use a center tag. I should mark this in red and, maybe circle it. Maybe point a bunch of arrows to it, because this is important. Don't use a center tag. Even if Google does it, don't use a center tag. And if we just right-click this element right here, inspect, we'll just right-click and inspect, and we go up our document, we'll see the center tag. If we change this to a divider and press enter, page is broken. And that's fine for now, I guess. I mean, it works for them if I refresh this page and get rid of that and add the center tag again. It works, but I still don't suggest it. Please don't use it.